Welcome to City Scene with Mayor Mike Cahill. I'm your host, Walt Kosmowski, and Mayor Cahill, welcome.
Hey, Walt, good to see you.
Good to see you, and you have brought a special guest with you today, Brian Ailes, who is the city's finance director. Brian.
Good to see you, Walt.
Good to have you back in the studio. And I think today, for the benefit of our audience, we're going to be talking about COVID and some of the repercussions of that and what our current situation is with COVID in the city. And we're going to be talking about the ARPA Act that Congress just passed and what its ramifications are for getting some revenue back into the city here for COVID purposes. So, Mr. Mayor, how does Beverly compare with our region and with the country in general with respect to pandemic statistics, vaccination rates, positive rates, that sort of thing?
Well, I'd say, we're doing a lot better than most other states. Massachusetts is really at the top of the list in terms of vaccinations, so that's good. We're tracking really closely the positive case rate, and we've been creeping up over the last several weeks. We're about at the same daily incidence of positive COVID cases that we were at back at the end of March, beginning of April, which was significantly down from last winter. Just for some comparison, we were getting about 80 to 85 cases per 100,000. Now, Beverly's not 100,000, so we're getting about 35, 40 new cases a day back last winter. Today, we're getting about 10 or 12 new cases a day, and this is based on testing, right? People aren't necessarily getting tested as much these days, and there are asymptomatic cases that people don't know they've got. But we're at a higher rate than we were early in the summer, and still at a much lower rate than we were in the spike last winter. But we're tracking it very carefully and trying to read that data and also track whether hospitalizations start to climb up. But in Massachusetts, we've been doing better, and it's not surprising, than states where the vaccination rates are much lower.
Yeah, I think Massachusetts, the last I heard, we were among the highest, if not the highest state, with about a 75 or 76% vaccination percentage.
And that's a percentage of eligible, because remember, nobody under 12 is eligible.
Yeah,
so
right,
we're looking at people eligible 12 and up.
Right.
That sounds about right on the
yeah.
percentage. Yeah.
And Mr. Mayor, is there anything you can tell us about the current hospitalization rate here in Beverly? Any statistics on that?
Not today. I mean, we get data from the hospital weekly, and I was on the phone earlier with the hospital president trying to get an update. We haven't seen a big spike in Beverly, but those numbers are going up on whole around the country. So it's really about breaking it down and looking at our own locality and region and state.
Yeah.
And so, as I said, we haven't had an alarm bell rung on that yet, and hopefully we won't.
Yeah. Now, the BevCam studio, as our viewers know, is located in the high school, and of course that was a touch and go situation up until almost just a week or two ago, and the city or the CDC and the state advised students, high schools, all public high schools, to come in wearing masks, but that's only effective until October 1st, I believe. So what happens there? Each school district makes its own determination. Right. And
so by touch and go, you meant whether or not people were going to be masked.
Wear masks or not, yeah.
I think everybody's expectation, goal and expectation, is that this school year be a regular school year in terms of full days on campus, in person. And we don't want anything less than that for our kids. And because of that, because of the Delta variant and the concerns that we may be seeing an upswing here, because of that, the State Department of Education, working with the Department of Public Health at the state level, they came out with an order, okay, to start the school year, everybody's got to mask up in the buildings at all times. Now, you can take mask breaks outdoors when you're outdoors for lunch or outdoor classes, and our school district's done a lot of work to set up outdoor learning spaces. You don't need to wear the mask when you're outdoors. You asked what happens after October 1st. What the state put in place is the school committees at the local level can reevaluate if a given school building has 80% or more compliance, or should I say 80% or more of all the personnel, the students and the adults working in the schools, If 80% or more are vaccinated, then a local school committee can reevaluate and maybe get rid of that requirement for vaccinated individuals. Unvaccinated at that point would still need to wear masks indoors. You know, we're not there in terms of those percentages. The vaccination numbers on the whole are strong in Massachusetts and on the whole are strong in Beverly. Our lowest rates among our subpopulations, 16 to 19-year-olds, are only somewhere in the mid to high 50s on vaccination percentages, and the 20 to 29-year-olds, young adults, are among adults, they're the lowest vaccinated group. And then, of course, our kids under 12 can't yet get a vaccine.
Right, yeah.
So I don't know that people should expect a change that quickly after October 1st. It may be that masks are the norm in the schools throughout the fall.
Yeah.
But that depends on vaccination rates locally, and it also depends on what happens with the Delta variant. Does it spike up? Does it run its course and not cause problems so much in our region as it has in other parts of the country? And then is there another variant coming behind it to worry about or not? Yeah. You know, we need to manage our way through this fall and winter and into the spring. And, you know, hopefully, as I said, everyone's goal is that the kids be in school full days, full classes, and they get the best they can out of this year.
That's the best possible, outcome. Now let's talk. You know, the federal government has been doing a lot in response to the COVID pandemic, and one of the things they did recently was they passed the so-called ARPA Act. And I'm going to turn over to you, Brian. Now, what exactly is the ARPA Act? It's the American Rescue Plan Act. What exactly is that, and how does that affect a city like Beverly, Brian?
Sure. So if I could just back up just a hair in the timeline. Prior to the ARPA Act being enacted earlier this calendar year, last calendar year during the pandemic, the city had access to what was referred to as CARES funds, and that was about $3.7 million to combat the pandemic over the last 18 months, addressing health risks, testing. We did some staffing adjustments to contact tracing and things of that nature. And so that money is set to expire this December. And then that pool of money will go away. And what we're looking to take advantage of now is this ARPA funding, which is coming our way. Yeah. And that gives us about a 3-year window of eligibility to spend these funds. In total, it's $12.6 million will be coming to Beverly in various allotments. And the way the allotments work, about 4.4 of that 12.6 comes because we're Beverly and because of our population. And every city and town across Massachusetts will receive a proportionate share similar.
Based on population alone.
Correct.
Okay.
And then in addition to that, every county is allotted a certain amount of money from the federal government. And because we're in Essex County and effectively the county government doesn't really exist, it gets reallocated out to the communities within that county. And so that will provide an additional $8.2 million to the city to use.
So what you're saying, the CARES Act, which was the initial, $3.7 million you mentioned?
Correct.
So have we spent all that, or have we gotten all of that yet?
There's a little bit more than $500,000 left of that, which will carry us through the end of the calendar year.
Okay. And the ARPA money, have we started receiving ARPA money yet, or we'll get that after we use up all the CARES money? What's the situation with that?
Yeah, so we've applied for the funding, and as a result of the application, the state has allocated us 50% of the money. So right now we have in a bank account 50% of that money. Our charter and our local ordinances require us to go before the city council before we can spend any of that money. So we currently have, the mayor has requested that the council review and approve the ability for us to spend those funds in accordance with the grant.
Right. So the ARPA money, we're not working directly with the feds. We're working, that's allocated through the states, and you're working with the state to get your ARPA money. Is that correct?
I'll jump in.
Yeah, sure.
So the CARES money, as Brian said, we have a little over $500,000 left. We've got to spend it by the end of this calendar year. We don't want to turn it back to the federal government. It's been allocated to us, so we're working to try to ensure that it gets spent effectively. on the right things and in a way that they'll ultimately approve its expenditure, right? The ARPA money, as Brian said, half of the 12.6 is in our accounts. The other half will come in the next several months. And what was the question?
Well,
working with the state.
Yeah.
So U.S. Treasury has issued guidelines for what's allowable and eligible expenditures. And they've done that they've had to interpret and read the legislative intent of Congress. So, they've given guidance, and we're looking at those broad categories of eligible expenditures now. And we want to make sure that at the end of the day, what we ultimately, with a lot of community input and a lot of dialogue and really an ongoing conversation, because we'll be spending this money over 3+ years, that we spend it in ways that after the fact, the U.S. Treasury won't say, sorry, that's not a way we're going to approve. Because then we would have to make up that money.
You'd have to send it back money? Or?
Well, we'd have to give them money back, and then we'd have to find another stream for, So
wow.
You know what I'm saying. So for example, last year, we worked with the state. The state had much more direct involvement with the CARES money than they are with the ARPA money. The state pre-approved us to spend, I think we spent over $600,000 on improving the HVAC systems at 2 of our elementary schools in preparation for the kids to be in the schools this past year. So that was to improve air handling and air transfer. And so we got that pre-approval. They're not doing pre-approvals with the ARPA funds. So we need to be very thorough and attentive and thoughtful about how we expend this money so it doesn't come back. And later, at some point in the future, we made a big expenditure and we're told that really wasn't the right way to do it.
Okay. Well, Brian, you said that we already have a certain amount of money in our bank account, but do we have to, that's not ours yet, we have to file some sort of an application to actually use that money, to draw that money out? How will that work?
So we filed the application and been approved for the federal government to give us those funds. So they've given them to us.
Okay.
The approval process that I referred to was more within our city. The mayor, anytime we receive any type of grant, the mayor has to request that the city council approve the expenditure of that grant.
Okay.
And that's by statute.
Okay. And have you had a meeting yet to get that approval, or is that coming up?
Right. So we presented to them last month, but understandably, I wouldn't have expected them to just turn around and vote it. So we asked them, if possible, to try to be ready to vote on it by their September 28th meeting, knowing that we're having a public meeting next week where we're inviting the public to share thoughts and concerns and ideas about how that money should be expended. We've also met with counselors. We've met with most of the counselors. We have a couple more to go to talk through some initial thoughts about where we see priorities, for expending the money, and get their input and their thoughts. As they and I are all elected to represent, everybody in the city, right? So, and we're working with some of the stakeholders who we know are close to some of the needs. So, Brian can go through the categories in a minute, but we know that our local affordable housing and social service nonprofits, we know that our local chamber and Main Streets, they're working with, be they individuals, families, neighborhoods, or be they local businesses. We know that they're close to the issues that people have been struggling with as well.
Sure.
So we're trying to work that conversation. And the last thing I'll say is next Tuesday evening, September 14th, we're going to have a public meeting from 7 to 9 p.m., and we're inviting anybody who has a thought to really join in and share those thoughts.
So we're sitting here, it's September 8th right now, it's a Wednesday.
Correct.
And this is next Tuesday, 6 days from now. And now, where will that meeting be held?
It'll be remote. It'll be a Zoom virtual meeting.
Zoom meeting. Okay, so people can weigh in on. And you're inviting anybody, all the public, or you'll publish the Zoom URL for that, and anybody in the public.
And if 2 hours isn't enough time, and it may well not be, we'll provide other ways for people to follow up with, be it email or phone call. And really, this money will be spent over 3+ years, not in the next couple of months. There are some expenditures that may come quickly because we've been looking for several months now, and tracking the needs and some of the things we think make sense to try to do to help address those needs.
Yeah. So now you mentioned that there were certain approved, if I can use that word, ways to spend this money. And Brian, can you give us an idea of what those specific approved ways are that we spend the money so that the feds don't want it back?
Yeah. So there's kind of 4 very broad categories, and we can talk about each one individually if you'd like, or however you want to handle it, Walt. The first piece that they identify is that they understand local governments, they being the Treasury and the federal government, the legislation. They understand that local governments have also felt the economic impact of the pandemic. We have a lot of flexible revenue streams that have fluctuated over the last 18 months, and as a result, we haven't taken in as much revenue as we would typically expect in a given year. Thus, we're not able to spend as much on general government services as we would in a typical year. So, recognizing that, they've allowed municipalities to identify through a formula what your quote-unquote lost revenue is. And once you identify that figure, you're then able to expense certain general government costs directly to the grant, which don't fall into any other type of category. Okay, so it's kind of like a general catch-all.
So if restaurants weren't open, let's say, right? So a lot of meals weren't eaten and a lot of taxes weren't paid on those meals.
Right.
So is this the kind of thing that you can say, gee, we didn't get X amount of dollars for? Because normally during a summer, however the period is, we'd have this many meals eaten at so many restaurants, and we would have gotten this amount of tax revenue. Is that sort of what?
You've hit the nail right on the head. That's a key area that we saw a decline in. Another big area, for instance, you may not think about this, but the revenue down at Lynch Park, for instance, the parking revenue. Because we limited certain access at certain times in the year, we didn't generate as much revenue. Well, that revenue, in turn, goes back into the park to keep the park up. And so we're able to kind of backfill some of that and charge certain expenditures to the grant. We've identified roughly about, we think it's going to be in the range of about $2 million based on the formula over the 3-year period that we'll be able to backfill of this $12.6 million.
Okay. And I know another one of the 4 that you are going to talk about, maybe you can talk about supporting the public health response, because there's been more pressure put on the public health system than normally would, more costs, more assets, more. So tell us about that.
So please jump in, Mayor, at any point. But this is an area that still there's unknowns. We know that this funding needs to last us 3 years. We don't know what the landscape looks like a year from now, never mind a month from now. So we need to be prepared to allocate resources quickly if we see certain spikes in certain types of variants, or we need to roll out different types of testing clinics, or different types of health responses that we've had to do over the last 18 months. And so these are this kind of tranche of spending is designed to address the specific health emergency.
Right. So these are things that the health department wouldn't normally be doing in a normal year where COVID wasn't prevalent, but because COVID is here, you've got to do these things and run these tests or hire these people or buy this equipment, and that's where that piece would come in. Is that?
Yeah, and we do know that there are some staffing needs throughout some of our direct health-facing departments that we're going to need to address with some of this money, because the typical annual budget doesn't have the capacity necessarily to do that. So this is a way we can maybe staff up in the health department in some areas to provide additional services that can help the public remain safe.
One thing that the pandemic has really lain bare in a really hard way for so many people is that there are real inequities in public health, or real inequities in healthcare. And there are a lot of people who are, the people who are most at risk on their health are the same people who are most at risk for their housing, right? I mean, it's a socioeconomic dynamic, and people who are closer to the edge, economically, that's a real challenge on both of those fronts. So on the health side, one thing that we've all been learning is that the way public health departments have been structured and staffed in city after city, town after town, that's not going to work going forward. It's not just the pandemic. The pandemic has really piled everything on to those departments. We're not unusual in that we have a health director, one full-time public health nurse, and 2 health inspectors. Okay?
Yeah.
And so we've staffed up, we've added several part-time temporary public health nurse positions, and we're looking at, and we've also increased the health inspector by half a position. Maybe we're going to go to a full position. Because, the health department's had to do some things this past year they've never had to do. And yet, public health, our local hospital system, our local community health center, which is located in Salem, our social service agencies, they're all part of that safety net. And our health department needs to be able to do more within that network going forward. So we'll be really looking carefully at how to restructure. Some of this will be temporary, right? Some of the money we spend may be for positions that are temporary,
right,
offering programs that are temporary. But I think we'll find as we go that some of what we begin to work on, begin to invest more in, may well show itself to be a long-term or a permanent need.
Yeah.
So that's where we want to be thoughtful about how we start to expend the grant money, recognizing that some of it will, some of that work will cease when the grant ends,
right,
but other parts of that work may need to be funded going forward.
Yeah, and there may be some things that we're not anticipating now or aren't even thinking
Absolutely.
about that could crop up tomorrow or next week or next year that you have to be ready for. Yeah,
I'd just add to that, Mayor. In addition to it may being a permanent or not permanent, we may feel that we can do some of the work internally within the city government. We also know that there's going to be aspects of this that we need to partner with community partners to get done. And that's why the input from the community is so important through this.
Yes, and other grants can help as well in the longer term. We just this year, just in the last couple of months, secured additional state funding in a partnership with several communities. We were sharing one mental health counselor amongst several police departments. We just were able to get a second full-time mental health counselor with an increase in the grant. So now Beverly is going to have essentially one of those full-time, and the other will be shared amongst another 3 communities. So that's increasing that capacity at a time when, again, with all the struggles and stresses that people have been facing, it's very much needed.
Yeah. So, Brian, what else? Now, we talked about a couple. What other categories of uses, like negative economic and health impacts, city infrastructure improvements? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, both of those are acceptable categories under the 150-page guidance that the Treasury issued. The mayor kind of alluded a little bit to some of the negative economic and health impacts that we know we may be able to address through this funding. Some of those, the allowability standards require us to look at our census tracts within the city. Some may be eligible, some may be not. That's an area that we really need to look at very closely before we go spending a lot of money in a particular initiative. But we're open to suggestions. That's why we're having these public meetings. That's why we're speaking with counselors to try to get as much input as we can before we start down any one path.
Here are 2 thoughts to share with you all. One, Bryant mentioned the census tracts. There are about 45 census tracts around the state that are eligible for extra attention with this money. We have one in Beverly. It's essentially between Rantoul Street and the Bass River down through Gloucester Crossing. And it's focused on financial need, on the challenges that the residents in this part of town face particularly, and the stressors of the pandemic. So we're looking carefully at how to better serve that neighborhood. And one of the things we are looking at that is both programmatic and infrastructure is the fact that the teen center on McPherson Drive, the McPherson Teen Center, really needs support. And so that's an area that we're looking at carefully for some capital upgrades, and also to make sure that there's enough offered for the young people down there. So that's one. And then the other one is, as we're looking at our $12.6 million and having this, we've had a really wide-ranging kind of freewheeling set of conversations amongst all our department heads, with counselors now, and started to work with a number of the community groups. And all that together, we also have to pay close attention to what the state is doing, because the state has its own resources and it also has a good amount of its own ARPA funding that the state is required and empowered to spend. So as a small city, we want to look at what the state is providing on the housing front, on the public health front, to make sure that we don't start to push money in a direction that it may be best for the state to help fund. So it's really feeling our way with them and communicating with the state as we go to make sure that we try to get that that best outcome. With it sounds like a lot of money that we're working with locally, but it can be spent quickly with a lot of really worthy efforts. And maybe to go back to the infrastructure piece beyond the teen center question, we know that we have an older housing stock that's all through the downtown and within that census tract area, because we know that thousands of units of housing were built in Beverly when the shoe went up in the early 1900s. And a lot of that is multifamily wood-framed housing that needs all kinds of energy retrofits for, to guard against the extremes of climate, the cold snaps in the winter and the heat waves, and will improve public health for those neighbors, and also can save them money with energy efficiencies. So we're looking at that and trying to figure out whether that's an area that is clearly comfortably eligible, and what we might accomplish if we try to invest within that area, for example.
How this is all kind of intertwined, isn't it? So now, Brian, do we have a certain fixed amount of time in which to spend this ARPA money?
Yes.
And what is that time?
So the term that the federal government uses, costs need to be incurred, and that's by the end of December 2024. So we've got a little more than 3 years before that money will cease to be available. All right.
Now, so we've just got about a minute left. Mayor Mike, can you repeat again when this public hearing will be for our viewers? This is
so next Tuesday evening, September 14th, 7 to 9 p.m. in a Zoom, and we'll be pushing that out there. And that's not the only opportunity by any means. We're looking for the council to take this up at their September 28th meeting, and given that we're going to be spending this money over the next 3+ years, it's really an ongoing conversation once we've all joined in it.
Yeah, very good. Well, we're just about out of time, and I'd like to thank my guests today, Mayor Mike Cahill, as always, and the city's finance director, Brian Ailes. Brian, good to see you again.
Yes, thank you.
And I'd like to remind our viewers that you've been watching City Scene with Mayor Mike Cahill. I'm your host, Walt Kosmowski, and we'll see you next time.